Breaking, 847 billion in reparations on the table, a threat of a mass African walkout from the United Nations, and a blueprint for a brand new Global South Assembly. While Western diplomats sat frozen in silence and the rest of the world stood up to clap. But here's the flip side. The UN was built to represent all nations, yet one African captain just asked, does it represent the people or the colonial accounts it never balanced? And then came the shock. Instead of asking for permission, he pulled out the invoice and the architectural plan for a different world order. Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader from Burkina Faso, took just 47 minutes at the podium to dismantle decades of polite hypocrisy. He placed a number, 847 billion, on France's colonial extraction and warned, if justice doesn't come, Africa may leave the table altogether. Before we break this down, let's make it personal. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your country in the comments, or tell us your own experience. Do you believe old institutions still serve your people, or do you feel they've already failed you? And if you're new here, welcome to Africa Daily. Good news. The channel that connects Africa's voice with global stories through sharp news and fearless storytelling. We're building a space where Africans, Americans, and audiences worldwide can challenge the official version together. So hit that subscribe button and join the conversation. Now, let's move deeper. Because this speech wasn't just a headline, it was a turning point, and it started with a stage, a microphone, and a number too big to ignore. It's not every day a single microphone in New York rattles 8 billion people. Yet on September 17, 2025, that's exactly what happened when Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso stood before the United Nations and called out the global order by name. He didn't ease into pleasantries. He went straight to the numbers, $847 billion drained from his country through France's colonial system, and a demand that the UN finally stop pretending this theft was anything but organized exploitation. That figure alone was enough to make even seasoned diplomats shift in their seats. Here's the catch. The UN chamber wasn't just listening to another African grievance. It was watching a young leader flip the script on 78 years of political theater. For decades, Africa's leaders were expected to ask nicely. Traoré didn't ask. He billed. And then he warned, either pay or watch Africa walk. That is the kind of ultimatum Americans might compare to a strike on Wall Street. Sudden, unapologetic, and costly if ignored. Behind the news headline lies the human picture. Imagine you've been paying into a system your whole life like Social Security, expecting stability. And then one morning you're told the money never really belonged to you, it was used elsewhere, and the people in charge call it partnership. Most Americans would feel robbed. That's how Africans have felt for decades under the CFA franc and the trade system Traoré exposed. And after that moment, the chamber wasn't hearing statistics anymore. It was hearing betrayal dressed up as international law. Mini hook. The applause proved it. When Traoré finished his opening salvo, 32 African nations rose to their feet, joined by China, Russia, India, and Brazil. The sound lasted for 12 minutes, drowning out the silence of Western delegations frozen in place. Mini twist. The louder the Global South clapped, the more the West looked like the minority it has always been, just not on paper. This is where it gets personal. Most people in the U.S. grow up trusting institutions. Even if they complain about Washington, they still expect the courts to open on Monday, the banks to cash their checks, the dollar to hold value. But what happens when trust erodes, not by mistake, but by design? According to social research, once people realize the rules were never written for them, their behavior changes overnight. Habits of patience turn into habits of defiance. That's exactly the shift Traoré was capturing for 1.4 billion Africans in that hall. A short story from the ground drives it home. A farmer outside Ouagadougou told a visiting journalist years ago that his cotton was sold before it was even picked. French companies had the rights, the price was fixed, and his village would never see the profit. That man's quiet frustration became part of Traoré's thunderous speech. One farmer's complaint scaled up into 847 billion of receipts. And now the stage was set. The tension wasn't just about reparations. It was about whether the old order could survive the weight of its own numbers. The chamber was holding its breath, and the next words would decide whether this was a one-time protest or the opening line of a movement that could not be ignored. What startled diplomats wasn't only the $847 billion figure, it was the evidence stacked behind it. Ibrahim Traoré didn't just hurl accusations at France. He came armed with charts, calculations, and international law. Gold extraction worth $285 billion since 1960. Uranium valued at $89 billion with only crumbs left for Burkina Faso. Cotton exported for $74 billion but spun into wealth in French factories. Layered on top of that, $312 billion siphoned through the CFA franc system, forcing African reserves into Paris vaults. Add it all together, and the demand for reparations stopped sounding like a political stunt and started looking like a balance sheet nobody wanted to read aloud. But here's the irony. The United Nations was built on declarations of equality. Yet a system that promised development became a pipeline of extraction. For an American audience, think of it like paying taxes your whole life and finding out the refund went straight into someone else's pocket. Most people wouldn't call that cooperation. They'd call it theft disguised as policy. And the twist kept coming. Traoré grounded his demand not in rage, but in legal precedent. UN Resolution 1514 on decolonization, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, the International Court of Justice rulings on state responsibility. Suddenly, the accusation wasn't just moral, it was actionable. Mini hook. The chamber realized this wasn't another fiery speech. It was a lawsuit in progress. Mini twist. The same UN treaties once used to justify Western dominance were being flipped into weapons of accountability. This raises a quiet question. How long can any institution survive if its own rules are used against it? Americans know this feeling in another way. According to surveys, when ordinary people believe the justice system no longer serves them, they don't stop believing in justice. They start looking for alternatives. That shift in behavior, from patience to building something new, is exactly what the Global South was hinting at with every clap that echoed across the chamber. Consider a short story from Ghana in the 1990s. A young lawyer worked pro bono for farmers who lost land to mining concessions. His argument was dismissed in court, but years later he told a journalist, "I lost the case, but I didn't lose the evidence. One day this will count." Traoré's speech felt like the day those forgotten files finally left the drawer and hit the world stage. And once evidence is laid out, silence becomes heavier than denial. The chamber understood this. Even those who didn't clap could not erase the numbers projected in front of them. Which meant the next move wasn't about whether the claim was real. It was about how the world would respond when the applause stopped echoing. The strangest thing about that United Nations chamber was not the speech itself, it was the silence that followed on the Western side. 32 African nations stood clapping, joined by China, Russia, India, and Brazil. But the seats of Europe and America stayed frozen, like spectators watching a storm they hoped would pass. That silence spoke louder than any rebuttal, because if the numbers were false, they would have shouted back. Instead, the absence of denial became its own confirmation. The applause lasted 12 minutes. Think about that. In diplomatic theater, applause is measured in seconds, not minutes. 12 minutes is what you give to history, not routine speeches. Mini hook. The chamber looked less like the UN of 1945 and more like a courtroom in 2025, with the Global South delivering a verdict the West couldn't overturn. Mini twist. The very moment meant to show international unity instead revealed international division more clearly than ever before. Here's where the human element matters. Most Americans are used to debates ending with compromise, bipartisan deals, half victories, something to take home. But when compromise means 6 decades of loss, patience collapses. According to social psychology studies, when groups believe their suffering has been ignored for more than one generation, their threshold for patience vanishes. They don't wait for reform, they demand replacement. That's what the applause symbolized, a tipping point where waiting quietly was no longer an option. Consider the short story of a Nigerian student who attended the UN gallery years ago. He once said he left discouraged because African leaders spoke carefully to avoid offending donors. Fast forward to 2025, and he's watching a Burkina captain call those same donors colonizers with a legal invoice attached. That shift from cautious to confrontational is not just a political change, it's a generational change. And if you think about it, audiences everywhere recognize the pattern. When someone finally says out loud what everyone whispers, the room either explodes with applause or hardens in silence. Which side would you have joined? It's a question worth asking yourself, because silence, too, is a choice. The longer the clapping lasted, the clearer it became that this moment was not theater. It was a declaration that the Global South was no longer satisfied being an audience to Western speeches, it was ready to become the speaker. And when a movement shifts from listening to declaring, the next act is inevitable. That's exactly where this story was heading, as the legal case turned into a political earthquake. Before we move further, if you find value in hearing Africa's story told on its own terms, consider supporting this channel. Subscribing, sharing, or even just commenting your perspective helps amplify voices often left in the background. And as the clapping faded, the tension in the chamber only grew heavier, because the next challenge wasn't applause, it was confrontation. It is a paradox that 5 countries who won a war 80 years ago can still veto the decisions of an entire planet. That's the system Ibrahim Traoré pointed at with surgical precision, and it landed like a slap across the chamber. The United States, Russia, China, Britain, and France, together less than 10% of the world's population, hold permanent power, while Africa, with 54 nations and 1.4 billion people, has none. The numbers no longer added up, and that contradiction became the heart of his attack. From there, the speech tore into what he called institutionalized imperialism. The World Bank and IMF were not portrayed as neutral lenders, but as colonial tools, pushing structural adjustments that dismantled local industries and locked entire nations into debt. Mini hook. When Burkina Faso tries to nationalize its gold mines, the West threatens sanctions. When it partners with Russia or China, it gets labeled a threat to the rules-based order. Mini twist. Whose rules? Traoré asked. And whose order? Because the fingerprints always seem to trace back to Paris, London, or Washington. For Americans watching, this may feel oddly familiar. Think about how people reacted during the 2008 financial crisis, when Wall Street was bailed out, but homeowners lost everything. Most citizens realized the rules of the game weren't written to protect them. And according to behavioral studies, once trust in an institution collapses, people don't just lose faith, they adapt, creating workarounds or building alternatives. That is exactly what the Global South applause represented. Adaptation after exhaustion. The hypocrisy was sharpened with one example: Libya. Under the doctrine of responsibility to protect, NATO bombed what was then Africa's most developed state, killing its leader and opening the gates to terrorism across the Sahel. Traoré asked the question out loud. Where was the UN's responsibility to protect Libyans from Western bombs? Mini hook. The same governments that lecture Africa on human rights have left trails of destruction in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Mini twist. Violence is legitimized when it comes from the West, but sovereignty becomes criminal when it comes from Africa. A story from Mali echoes this point. A teacher in Bamako told reporters that after the Libya war, his classroom filled with displaced children. He said, "We had textbooks but no desks, because the wood was being used for refugee shelters." His words carried the quiet cost of decisions made thousands of miles away. And when Traoré retold Africa's grievances in New York, that teacher's voice was present in the background, even if no one noticed. This section of the speech wasn't just about institutions, it was about the arrogance of a system that refuses to update itself. And once you see the imbalance that clearly, it becomes hard to unsee. The chamber felt that weight, because the question was no longer whether the system was flawed, but how long it could survive once its contradictions were laid bare. And that realization pushed the momentum toward what came next, where critique transformed into a radical proposal. The most surprising moment wasn't the demand for reparations, it was what came after. Instead of leaving the UN stage with a list of grievances, Ibrahim Traoré presented something no one expected: an entirely new map of global governance. A global South Assembly, equal votes for every country, a development bank without conditionalities, a reparations court with binding power, and even a South-South Security Council to replace the one dominated by old empires. It was no longer just a speech. It was the launch of an institution in real time. That's why the room reacted the way it did. For decades, Africa news at the UN followed a pattern. Leaders criticized, the West promised reform, and then the cycle repeated. Traoré's blueprint shattered that rhythm. Mini Hook. Instead of asking to share a table, he threatened to build a new one. Mini Twist. The moment Burkina Faso, one of the world's poorest countries, stood at the podium and offered the majority of humanity a new home, the hierarchy of who gets to design institutions quietly flipped. It resonates with a universal truth. Human beings, if they can't get fairness inside the system, eventually try to create one outside it. Most Americans understand this through daily life. When consumers feel cheated by big banks, they invent alternatives like credit unions or even crypto. According to surveys, once people realize an institution is rigged, their loyalty doesn't fade slowly, it collapses suddenly. That collapse was exactly what the applause symbolized. A story from Kenya captured this shift. In 2018, a group of young professionals grew tired of waiting for IMF-backed projects to deliver jobs. They pooled their savings and built a cooperative tech hub in Nairobi. Within 2 years, it attracted investors from Asia, not Europe. One of the founders later said, "We stopped waiting for the West to validate us." Hearing Traoré's speech, you could almost imagine that same mindset applied to entire nations. And here's the twist layered on top. The more the Global South endorsed the plan, the more defensive Western powers became. Washington warned of division. Paris dismissed the numbers as baseless, and London called reparations economically impossible. But silence lingered behind those denials, because refuting specifics is harder than repeating slogans. This wasn't just a clash of policies. It was a clash of imaginations. Africa's sovereignty was no longer a slogan on the street. It was being drawn into the architecture of new institutions. And once imagination shifts, history has a habit of following. The chamber could feel it. Something bigger than a speech was unfolding, and the outlines of a parallel world order were no longer abstract. They were visible, step by step, like scaffolding rising around an old building, which meant the confrontation was only beginning. The applause had turned into architecture, and architecture always demands construction. The real question was no longer whether the idea would catch on. It was how quickly the pressure would build once the first bricks were laid. What unsettled Western leaders wasn't the number Traoré demanded. It was how quickly momentum gathered behind him. Within hours, China, Russia, India, Brazil, and 32 African nations had voiced support. Yet in private, Western diplomats scrambled, warning partners against joining the December conference in Ouagadougou. On the surface, they spoke of unity, but behind the curtains they leaned on threats of loan suspensions, investment freezes, and media campaigns. That contradiction revealed the truth. If Traoré's words were meaningless, there would have been no rush to contain them. The harder the West pushed to dismiss the idea, the more it admitted the idea had power. The psychology of it is familiar. Most Americans know the feeling when a company insists your complaint doesn't matter, yet immediately hires lawyers to silence you. Silence would prove confidence. Panic proves vulnerability. And according to studies on group behavior, once people sense an institution is rattled, they no longer see it as invincible. In Africa, the applause was more than symbolic. It showed that sovereignty was no longer a dream to be whispered. It was an expectation, much like workers in the US during the Great Resignation who realized they could walk away from employers who undervalued them. African governments began to see departure from the old system as not reckless, but rational. A story from Latin America helps explain why the message resonated. In Venezuela, local communities once turned to barter and regional currencies when sanctions cut them off from global finance. It wasn't ideal, but it kept families alive. That kind of improvisation proved people can adapt faster than outsiders expect. And if small towns can shift under pressure, what happens when entire continents move together? By the week's end, one thing was clear. The debate was no longer whether Traoré's demand was outrageous. The debate had shifted to whether the world could stop others from making the same demand. And that realization set the stage for the most dangerous part of his proposal, the precedent it threatened to unleash. The greatest risk wasn't Burkina Faso's demand itself, it was the chain reaction it could ignite. If one country could calculate 847 billion in losses and demand repayment, why wouldn't Ghana, Nigeria, or Senegal run the same numbers? And beyond Africa, what about India with colonial-era debts, or Latin America with centuries of resource extraction? One claim becomes dozens, and suddenly the wealth of empires looks less like permanent capital and more like borrowed time. This is how legitimacy unravels. The very treaties that once justified control could now be used to demand justice. What was once a shield for the powerful had turned into a weapon for the powerless. From a human perspective, it's the same dynamic seen in everyday life. In workplaces, people tolerate unfair bosses until someone files the first lawsuit. The moment one case succeeds, others line up, and the floodgates open. Social research shows that collective silence often breaks not gradually but all at once. When people see that speaking out doesn't end in punishment, they find their courage. Think of Americans watching class action lawsuits against tobacco or oil companies. For years, victims stayed quiet, believing nothing could change. Then a single victory in court proved otherwise, and the dominoes fell. Traoré's speech hinted at that same domino effect on a global scale. Only this time, the defendant was not a corporation, but entire governments. A story from the Caribbean underscores this point. In Barbados, historians documented Britain's sugar wealth down to the last pound sterling. For decades, those files collected dust. But once reparations entered mainstream debate, the same records became legal evidence. Yesterday's history turned into today's invoice. That transformation, archival grief becoming financial claim, is exactly what the UN chamber felt when Traoré spoke. Western diplomats called the demands unrealistic, but their rushed denials sounded less like confidence and more like fear. Fear not of Burkina Faso alone, but of the precedent it represented. Because once the majority of the world realizes they share the same grievance, the weight of silence becomes impossible to maintain. The chamber sensed it. Africa's sovereignty was no longer a moral appeal. It was a legal and financial threat that could spread faster than any resolution. And with that recognition, the applause that began as support for one leader turned into something heavier. The sound of a system hearing its own cracks. What remained was the question of how long it could stand before those cracks widened into a collapse.